Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you a question. Have you ever felt like life was dealing you blow after blow? Like you're walking through a storm that just won't end, and you wonder, God, where are you in this? Faith in the midst of struggles is not about the absence of hardship, but about maintaining your trust in God when everything seems uncertain. It's easy to have faith when everything is going well, when the sun is shining and life feels secure. But real faith, the kind that moves mountains, is forged in the fire of adversity. It's in the storms of life that our faith is tested, refined, and ultimately strengthened. When you're walking through a tough season, it can feel like God is distant, like you're facing an uphill battle with no end in sight. You may even question, why is this happening to me? Where is God in all of this? But this is where the power of faith comes in. Faith doesn't always have to see the solution right away. It's the belief that God is still in control, even when you can't see how He's working. It's the confidence that He is with you in the struggle, that He has not forgotten you, and that He will never leave you nor forsake you. In times of struggle, we must remember that faith is not about understanding every single detail of our situation. It's about knowing that God knows what we need even before we ask. Faith says, even though I don't see it, I trust you, God. Even though I don't understand it, I believe you're working. This kind of faith doesn't ignore the pain or pretend that everything is fine. Instead, it acknowledges the reality of the struggle while still holding on to the truth that God is good, faithful, and present. The Bible reminds us of this in 2 Corinthians 5:7, for we live by faith, not by sight. This doesn't mean we ignore the challenges we face. It means we choose to see beyond the immediate pain and trust in God's promise that He is working all things for our good. When we place our faith in God, we shift our focus from the problem to the problem solver. Yes, you might be walking through a season of difficulty, but God has promised to be our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in times of trouble. It's in those moments when all hope seems lost that God begins to reveal the depth of His faithfulness to us. When you choose to trust Him in the middle of the storm, you create the space for God to work in ways you never expected. Faith doesn't deny the existence of challenges, but it magnifies the power of God over those challenges. It acknowledges that the battle is real, but the victory has already been secured in Christ. Faith is believing that God can bring light into the darkest places. It's the assurance that He has a purpose in the pain, a reason for the struggle, and a plan that is bigger than the trial you're facing. Even when you don't feel like it, faith declares that God is still good and worthy of your trust. Faith, especially in the midst of struggles, isn't passive. It's active. It's a decision to continue moving forward, even when the path ahead is unclear. It's about taking one step at a time, one day at a time, trusting that God will lead you through the wilderness. And sometimes it's in the act of continuing to move forward, despite the storm, that we discover the true strength of our faith. God is not waiting for you to have all the answers before He acts. He's waiting for you to trust Him in the midst of your questions, your pain, and your uncertainty. It's when you keep your faith intact, even when everything else is falling apart, that you position yourself for the blessing God has for you on the other side of the struggle. One of the most challenging aspects of walking in faith is understanding God's timing. As human beings, we are accustomed to living in a world governed by schedules, deadlines, and immediate results. We want things to happen on our terms, according to our plans, and when we think it's the right moment. But God's timing operates on a different level, and it often doesn't line up with our expectations. God's timing is perfect, even when it feels like it's taking too long. In fact, sometimes we can find ourselves questioning His delay. Why is this happening now? Why not sooner? Why not later? Why this way? These are all valid questions, but the truth is, God's timing is not just about when something happens, but about the perfect circumstances He orchestrates for that moment. What may feel like a delay or a detour is often God working behind the scenes, aligning everything in ways we can't see, preparing us for what is to come. In the book of Ecclesiastes, we are reminded that there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. Ecclesiastes 3:1. This scripture speaks to the certainty that every moment in our lives has a purpose and nothing is wasted. God's timing is always in sync with His ultimate plan for our lives. Even when we don't understand the reasons for a particular season, God is using that time to shape us, teach us, and prepare us for something greater. Think about the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a child, but they had to wait. And not just for a few months or years, but for decades. The promise seemed impossible. In their human minds, it didn't make sense. Sarah, who was barren, and Abraham, who was already advanced in age, found themselves at the very edge of hope. But God's timing was perfect. He didn't give them a child when they expected it, and He didn't give it to them on their timetable. But when the time was right, at a point where human effort could not take credit, God delivered His promise. Sarah, in her old age, bore Isaac, and from that moment, God's plan unfolded in ways that would bless the entire world through their descendants. We see a similar theme with the story of Joseph. Joseph had a dream as a young boy that one day his brothers and even his father would bow down to him. But that dream didn't unfold the way Joseph expected. Instead of rising to power immediately, Joseph was sold into slavery, falsely accused, thrown into prison, and endured years of hardship. At each stage, it would have been easy to question God's timing. Why was he suffering so long? Why wasn't his dream being fulfilled faster? But when the appointed time came, Joseph was elevated to second in command in Egypt, and the dream was realized exactly as God had promised. God's timing was perfect, and Joseph was able to see how every part of his journey was necessary to prepare him for the position he would ultimately hold. Consider the story of Jesus' life. In the Gospels, we see that Jesus' ministry didn't begin until he was about 30 years old, though he was the Son of God and could have started his mission at any time. But God's timing, even in the life of his son, was precise. Jesus didn't perform miracles or begin teaching until the right moment, according to God's plan. Even when Jesus was preparing to die for the sins of the world, he made it clear to his disciples that his time had not yet come, reminding them that his death would happen at the exact right time. Jesus' obedience to God's timing and his willingness to wait for the appointed moment allowed him to fulfill his ultimate mission in the most powerful way possible. When we're faced with waiting, it can be difficult to see the bigger picture. It's easy to become frustrated or discouraged. But God's timing is never about delay or denial, it's about preparation. Waiting often works in us a deeper trust, greater patience, and a more profound understanding of who God is. When we allow God to move in his perfect timing, we position ourselves for his best. It's essential to remember that God's timing is not just about when things happen, but about when we are ready for them. There are moments when we ask God for something, and he responds with, "Not yet." That "not yet" is not a refusal. It's an invitation to grow, to learn, to wait patiently, and to trust that the right time is coming. When the time finally comes, we can see that God has perfectly aligned the circumstances, prepared our hearts, and set everything in motion for his plan to unfold in ways we couldn't have imagined. God's timing isn't just about the event, it's about the process that prepares us to receive the blessing he has for us. Adversity is something we all face at different points in our lives. Whether it's personal, financial, relational, or even spiritual struggles, no one is immune to challenges. In those moments, it's easy to feel defeated, overwhelmed, and even angry at the situation. But there is something incredibly powerful that happens when we choose to look at adversity through the lens of growth. Growth through adversity doesn't come automatically. It requires intentionality, perspective, and a willingness to allow hardship to shape us rather than break us. The truth is, the hardest moments of our lives often lead to the most profound growth. When we experience adversity, it's like a refining fire, burning away the things that aren't necessary and strengthening the parts of us that remain. We are told in the Bible that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, James 1:3. Adversity tests us, and through that test, we develop perseverance and endurance that keeps us moving forward even when the road is tough. It is not easy to persevere, especially when the storm seems unending. But it is in the perseverance that we are stretched and made stronger. Adversity becomes the training ground for our character, helping us become more resilient, patient, and steadfast in our faith. Think about how muscles grow. When we lift weights or push our bodies to their limits, we are actually causing small tears in the muscle fibers. These tiny tears might hurt at first, but they allow the muscles to rebuild stronger than before. The process is painful, but the result is growth. Similarly, when we face trials in our lives, we often experience pain. But that pain is a necessary part of the growth process. God uses our hardships to build our spiritual muscles, making us more equipped to handle future challenges. Adversity also has the power to shape our character. It reveals things about us that we may not have been aware of: our weaknesses, our fears, our insecurities. But it also brings out strengths we didn't know we had. Sometimes we don't realize how strong we are until we face a challenge that forces us to tap into those deeper reserves of strength. We may discover an unshakable faith, a deep well of perseverance, or a newfound sense of courage that we would never have accessed if everything had been easy. The process of growth through adversity also involves learning how to rely on God. When we face difficulties, we often come to the realization that we are not in control. We cannot change our circumstances by sheer willpower or hard work alone. In those moments, we learn to lean on God, to trust that He is in control and that He has a plan for us. As we surrender our struggles to Him, we discover that He is not only the source of our strength, but also the one who gives us peace and hope in the midst of the storm. Consider the example of Job in the Bible. Job's story is a testament to how adversity can lead to spiritual growth. Job was a man who had everything: wealth, health, a family, and lost it all in a series of devastating events. He faced unimaginable suffering, and his faith was tested to the extreme. But even in his pain, Job chose to trust God. His journey through suffering revealed the depth of his faith, his reliance on God, and his ability to persevere through the worst of circumstances. By the end of his story, Job's faith was stronger than ever, and God restored to him even more than he had lost. When we choose to grow through adversity, we also learn the value of empathy and compassion. People who have faced hardship are often the ones who can relate to the struggles of others in a deeper, more meaningful way. The pain we experience equips us to comfort others in their time of need. It's often through our struggles that we develop the ability to walk alongside others who are suffering, offering them hope, encouragement, and a shoulder to lean on. Finally, growth through adversity teaches us the importance of perspective. When we're in the middle of a trial, it can be hard to see beyond the pain. But if we can learn to shift our perspective, we may be able to see the bigger picture. What seems like a roadblock in the moment may be a divine setup for something greater. Adversity forces us to rely on God's promises more deeply and trust that He will use everything, even our struggles, for good. God doesn't waste our pain. He uses it to transform us into the people He has called us to be. He uses adversity to mold us, shape us, and refine us. And when we choose to trust Him in the midst of our struggles, we find that the very adversity that threatened to destroy us becomes the vehicle through which God brings about transformation and growth in our lives. Perspective is one of the most powerful forces in our lives. It shapes how we experience our circumstances, how we relate to others, and how we respond to challenges. In many ways, our perspective determines the quality of our life. Two people can face the same situation, yet one can feel overwhelmed and defeated, while the other feels empowered and ready to tackle the challenge. What makes the difference? It all comes down to perspective. The power of perspective lies in its ability to change how we interpret and respond to the world around us. It's not about changing the situation itself, but changing how we see it. Often the problems we face aren't as insurmountable as they first appear. They're simply magnified by our limited or negative perspective. But when we begin to view things through a different lens, our entire experience changes. The challenges we once feared can become opportunities for growth, and the obstacles that seemed impossible can become stepping stones towards something greater. Consider the story of the Israelites in the Bible. When they were faced with the giant walls of Jericho, the people saw an insurmountable barrier, an obstacle that appeared to block their way to the promised land. But God saw it differently. He didn't tell them to fight the wall with swords or power. He told them to march around it and trust in His plan. Their perspective, if they had focused solely on the size of the wall, would have led them to hopelessness. But when they changed their perspective and obeyed God's instructions, they saw a miraculous victory. What seemed like a barrier became a gateway to God's promise. The power of perspective shifted their focus from the problem to God's solution. In our own lives, we often face walls that seem too high to climb or too strong to break. These walls could be financial struggles, relationship issues, health problems, or even spiritual dryness. Our initial reaction may be to focus on the enormity of the issue and feel helpless. But the key to overcoming these barriers lies in how we choose to perceive them. When we shift our perspective and choose to see God's power, faithfulness, and provision, we start to understand that no problem is too big for Him to handle. This shift in perspective opens the door for us to experience His strength in our weakness. Our perspective also plays a crucial role in how we handle adversity. Life is full of challenges, and it's easy to become discouraged when things don't go as planned. But when we look at adversity through the lens of faith, we begin to see it differently. Instead of seeing hardship as something to avoid, we can see it as an opportunity for growth. The Apostle Paul wrote about this in Romans 5:3-4, where he said, "We also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope." When we view suffering with the perspective of endurance and character building, we gain a deeper appreciation for the transformative power of adversity. Another key aspect of perspective is how we see ourselves. Our self-image is shaped by how we perceive ourselves in relation to the world around us. If we see ourselves as victims, unable to overcome the difficulties we face, we will approach life with fear and doubt. But when we see ourselves through God's eyes as His beloved children, equipped with His power and purpose, we begin to live with a renewed sense of confidence. This shift in perspective helps us to approach life's challenges with strength and determination, knowing that we are never alone and that God is always with us. Perspective also affects our relationships with others. How we view the people around us can greatly influence our interactions with them. If we focus only on their flaws or mistakes, we will see them through a critical and judgmental lens. But when we choose to see others as God sees them, as people worthy of love and grace, it transforms our relationships. The power of perspective allows us to offer forgiveness, extend grace, and see the best in others, even when they fall short. This shift in perspective can heal broken relationships and build stronger, more compassionate connections. One of the most powerful ways to shift our perspective is to focus on gratitude. Gratitude has the ability to change our outlook on life completely. When we start counting our blessings instead of dwelling on what we lack, we begin to see how much God has already provided. Gratitude changes our perspective from one of scarcity to one of abundance, reminding us of God's faithfulness and goodness, even in difficult times. Instead of focusing on what's wrong, gratitude helps us to focus on what is right and all the ways God is at work in our lives. Ultimately, the power of perspective lies in its ability to transform how we experience life. It's not about changing our circumstances, it's about changing how we see them. By choosing to look at life through the lens of faith, gratitude, and God's promises, we open ourselves up to a world of possibility. When we allow God to shift our perspective, we begin to see that even the most difficult situations can be opportunities for His glory to shine through. And with that new perspective, we can approach every challenge with the confidence that God is with us, leading us and guiding us towards something greater. Life has a way of throwing us into situations that feel like nothing but chaos, unforeseen circumstances, heart-wrenching losses, and trials that seem unending. In those moments, it can be incredibly difficult to see the hand of God at work, especially when everything around us seems to be falling apart. But the truth is, some of the most profound miracles we experience in life are often wrapped in messes. These messy moments, though hard to endure, are the very places where God often does His most significant work. When we think about miracles, we tend to picture things that are neat, tidy, and easy to understand, something that instantly resolves a problem or changes our situation in a clear and remarkable way. But often God's miracles don't come in the form of immediate resolutions. They come in the middle of the mess, the chaos, and the confusion. God doesn't always remove us from the mess, but He steps into it with us and uses it for something greater. Take, for example, the story of the Israelites' journey through the wilderness. After they were freed from slavery in Egypt, they found themselves wandering in the desert for 40 years. The wilderness was a place of discomfort, uncertainty, and hardship. Yet it was in the mess of the wilderness that God performed some of the greatest miracles: the parting of the Red Sea, manna from heaven, water from a rock, and the protection and guidance that led them to the promised land. Had they not been in the wilderness, they wouldn't have witnessed these miracles. The mess became the space for God's miraculous provision and care. Similarly, think about the life of Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused and thrown into prison. His life was a tangled web of betrayal, injustice, and uncertainty. At any point in his journey, Joseph could have looked at his circumstances and believed that God had abandoned him. But in the middle of that mess, Joseph's miracle unfolded. From the pit to the prison, Joseph's path led him to a place of influence and power in Egypt, where he would ultimately save not only his family, but also an entire nation from famine. The mess of his circumstances, while painful and unjust, was the very place where God's greater purpose was revealed. There's also the story of Jesus and the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples had been with Jesus all day, and they were in a remote place with nothing but a few loaves of bread and fish to feed the crowd. The situation seemed impossible, and the disciples felt helpless. Yet, in the middle of this mess, both the physical need for food and the emotional mess of the disciples, Jesus performed a miracle. He took what was inadequate, what seemed to be a mess, and turned it into a feast for thousands. This miracle didn't happen when everything was perfectly prepared, but when the situation was dire and all human resources seemed exhausted. Jesus used the mess to demonstrate God's power to provide in ways that no one could have anticipated. Miracles also happen in the messy, broken places of our hearts. Often we look at our struggles, our fears, our insecurities, our past mistakes, and we feel like there's no way forward, that we are too broken for God to use. But it is in these messy, imperfect parts of our lives that God does some of his most incredible work. Jesus, in his love, doesn't come to fix us from the outside in. He comes into the mess of our hearts, heals our wounds, and transforms us from the inside out. It's in the brokenness that God is able to shape us, refine us, and draw us closer to himself. Sometimes God allows us to go through seasons of mess because he knows that these seasons are what will prepare us for the miracles he has for us. The mess is often the place where we are stripped of our self-sufficiency and forced to rely on him. It's in the mess that we learn to trust, to grow, and to believe that God is capable of bringing beauty from ashes. In Isaiah 61:3, we are promised that God will bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. What seems like a mess to us is often the place where God is working behind the scenes, preparing us for something beautiful. Moreover, messes provide an opportunity for God to show us his glory in a way that we would never experience otherwise. If everything were always neat and easy, we might not see the depth of God's power, grace, and love. It's through the mess that we are reminded that he is a God who can take the impossible, the broken, and the flawed, and turn them into something greater than we ever imagined. God's miracles don't always come wrapped in the perfection we expect, but in the middle of the mess, he is working. He is transforming, healing, and redeeming. So when you find yourself in the middle of a messy situation, remember this. It may be in that very mess that your miracle is waiting to unfold. God is able to take what seems like a hopeless situation and turn it into a testimony of his power, provision, and grace. Obedience is one of the most powerful yet challenging principles in our walk with God. In a world that encourages self-reliance, independence, and personal freedom, the idea of submitting ourselves to God's will can feel counterintuitive. Yet the Bible continually highlights the profound blessing that comes through obedience to God's commands. Obedience is not just a rule to follow, it's a pathway to experiencing God's best for our lives. One of the most powerful things about obedience is that it unlocks the blessings God has planned for us. God is not a distant figure handing out rules from afar. He is a loving Father who desires only the best for his children. His commands are not burdensome, but are designed to guide us toward a life filled with purpose, peace, and fulfillment. When we align ourselves with his will, we position ourselves to receive his blessings in ways we could never have imagined. In the Old Testament, we see God repeatedly emphasize the importance of obedience. In Deuteronomy 28, God outlines the blessings that will follow if his people obey his commands. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 28:1-2. The list that follows speaks of prosperity, health, protection, victory, and abundance. The blessings are so abundant that it is hard to even fathom them, but they are conditional on one thing: obedience. It's essential to recognize that obedience is not about legalism or trying to earn God's favor. God's love for us is not based on our ability to keep every command perfectly. However, obedience is an expression of our trust in God. When we obey him, we are acknowledging that he knows what is best for us and that we trust his plan more than our own. It is an act of surrender, a recognition that we are not in control, but God is. It's through this trust and surrender that God can bless us in ways that go far beyond our comprehension. One example of the blessing of obedience can be seen in the life of Abraham. In Genesis 12, God calls Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a land that God would show him. Abraham didn't know where he was going or what the future held, but he chose to obey. His obedience led him to become the father of many nations, a man whose faith and obedience would shape the entire course of history. Abraham's blessing was not just material, but spiritual, as God established a covenant with him that would extend to generations to come. His obedience set the stage for the fulfillment of God's promise to bring salvation to the world through Jesus Christ. Another powerful example of the blessing of obedience is found in the life of the prophet Samuel. When God gave Samuel a difficult task to anoint David as king while Saul was still in power, Samuel could have hesitated. But in 1 Samuel 15:22, he reminds Saul of the importance of obedience, saying, "To obey is better than sacrifice." God was more concerned with Samuel's willingness to follow his commands than with the offerings he could present. Samuel's obedience brought God's will to pass, ensuring that David would take the throne and establish a kingdom that would last forever. In the New Testament, we see Jesus himself exemplify the ultimate model of obedience. Though he was the Son of God, he chose to obey his Father even when it meant suffering and death on a cross. In Philippians 2:8, it says, "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." Jesus' obedience brought the ultimate blessing to all of humanity, salvation. His obedience was not only an act of love for his Father, but an act of love for us, and it unlocked the blessing of eternal life for all who would believe in him. Obedience to God's word brings peace and assurance. When we follow God's commands, we are walking in his will, and that gives us confidence, even in the midst of life's storms. Psalm 119, 165 says, "Great peace have those who love your law, and nothing can make them stumble." Obedience, even in the most difficult of circumstances, brings a deep sense of peace because we know we are in alignment with God's will. Furthermore, obedience opens the door to greater spiritual intimacy with God. When we obey him, we show that we value our relationship with him above all else. Jesus tells us in John 14:15, "If you love me, keep my commands." Obedience is the fruit of love and devotion. It draws us closer to God, helping us to hear his voice more clearly and to experience his presence in deeper ways. The more we obey, the more we grow in our relationship with him. Obedience is also a testimony to the world. In a culture that often values independence and self-sufficiency, our obedience to God stands as a witness to his goodness and faithfulness. When we follow his commands, even when the world is telling us to do otherwise, we reflect the light of Christ. Our obedience becomes a testimony to the power of God's transformative love in our lives. While obedience may sometimes feel difficult, even countercultural, it is always worth it. The blessings that flow from obedience are not just material, they are spiritual, emotional, and relational. They are blessings that come from knowing we are walking in God's will, experiencing his peace, and living in the fullness of his love. Obedience is not about achieving perfection, but about surrendering to God and trusting that he knows what is best for us. When we walk in obedience, we open ourselves to the incredible blessings God has in store.